Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Mr. Erik Uliasz. Mr. Uliasz is an AP psychology teacher at Wyomissing Junior Senior High School in Pennsylvania. He has been teaching psychology for 20 years and is an AP reader for the College Board for 9 years. Teaching psychology has been such a big part of his life, but besides that, he's also a track and field coach for his high school. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Uliasz, and I'm excited you're here to speak for us.
My pleasure, Brandon.
Since you're super knowledgeable in psychology, can you talk to me about the connection between psychology and neuroscience?
Um, well, right now I would say that neuroscience field is an exploding field in psychology, probably within the last 10 years. Everything about brain scans and brain imaging seems to be in vogue right now. It seems to be the in thing. So a lot of psychology is really emphasizing neuroscience. We all like to see a good brain scan, how our brain is active, and then when you pair that with, um, sports and other practical applications, I think it gets a lot of attention.
Can you explain what neuroscience specifically is?
I would say just neuroscience is using the brain. And now within the last, 20, 30 years, we have all these different um, brain imaging techniques that have exploded to allow us to capture what's doing in the brain. The brain's hard to access. I mean, it's in hard skull. You can't see it. So unless there were some brain injuries, it was really hard to study the brain. So with the advances with MRIs and fMRIs, we've been able to do a lot more research without causing any permanent damage to our human subjects. So yeah, it's really using the brain and the brain chemicals and what parts of the brain are active when we think about certain topics or when we do certain actions.
So, how is neuroscience and the brain connect to sports and affect our everyday life?
Oh boy, well, everything is psychological at the same time biological, right? The reason why you want to pick up a phone to check your text message is because of the release of dopamine, okay? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's linked with pleasure. So everything we do, say, all relates to the brain and the exchange of these chemicals. Um, and obviously with sports that plays a huge role. I mean, there's research that shows that when you win a contest you get this burst of testosterone, this burst of dopamine, and when we lose we have a detraction of those chemicals. And it's interesting, even for sports fans, seeing their team lose causes a diminishment of the testosterone and those dopamine chemicals. So really it's all about the brain.
Perfect. And in psychology, there is the Yerkes Dodson Law. Can you touch on that and how that law applies to sports?
Absolutely. That relates to how much arousal is necessary to be successful in a task. So it's really like a upside down U-shaped curve where there is the peak of that curve is where you want to be for a task. And it differs on the type of tasks. More difficult tasks, you are going to want a lower level arousal, and easier tasks, you want a more higher level arousal. Let me give you an example. So let's suppose you're a 100-meter sprinter. That's a relatively cognitive easy task. You don't really need to think a whole much about sprinting really fast. So you want to make sure your arousal levels are up, meaning your heart rate, your breathing. This is why you do wind sprints and you do all these bounding drills to get your heart rate up. So when the gun goes off, boom, you go. Because if your arousal levels are too low, you're not going to compete at a high level and be happy with the result. By way of contrast, let's take a basketball player. A basketball player gets fouled, okay, he goes to free throw line. What's immediately what you do when you go to the free throw line? You take a deep breath, you dribble the ball, you relax, because shooting a free throw is actually significantly more challenging than like hitting a layup. So you want to make sure you get your arousal level down. So the Yorks Dodson Law is extremely important for sports to know where is that level of arousal. You want to be pumped up enough, but you don't want like adrenaline shooting out of your ears that you're going to make mistakes. Another example would be like on the football field, because when we're super aroused and we're super pumped up, you're going to make fouls, you're going to go offside, you're going to commit silly penalties. So it's like a balance, and I really think the Yerkes Dodson Law is very important in sports, trying to find where is that level of balance in your arousal levels.
That's a great example. Can you touch on what arousal really means, though?
Yeah, I should clarify. Arousal is not necessarily sexual. Okay, arousal just simply means your body's activation, your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure, how much you're sweating, basically your body's level of energy levels. You want that really, really, really high in low, uh, low cognitive kind of areas, and you want that kind of diminished in areas that require more concentration.
Got it. And you also, why do we need to use our frontal lobes less during some sports and let the cerebellum do its thing, as you said?
Okay, well, the frontal lobes is what is responsible for executive functions. It makes us most human. It's planning, judgment, those sort of things. And one would think we want the more of that, the better to minimize mistakes. The cerebellum, by way of contrast, is in the back of our head and it's responsible for just like automatic motor functions. Happens almost automatically without conscious awareness. Um, so that cerebellum is where automatic skill memory happens. Okay, and really what you want to do is to be very, very efficient. You want to have less activity in your motor cortex or your frontal lobes, and you want that to move back to the cerebellum to be more automatic processing. I can give you an example here, and this comes from Erik Uliasz. He's an associate professor for sports biomechanics at the University of Bath. Sela was working with a number of British athletes and was working with Ashley Nelson. She's a sprinter and she's one of Great Britain's premier 100-meter runners. And he said to her, look, if Ashley starts to think about what she's doing in her 100-meter dash, or she starts thinking about where her fellow athletes are in the relay race, her neural system will break down and her technique breaks down, and she's not as effective. So, really, in a well learned task, you want to rely on your cerebellum more. Automatic processing is oftentimes superior in, especially in like a 100-meter event where otherwise, if you start using your frontal lobe, you start almost questioning yourself. Did I get out fast enough? What am I doing? And oftentimes, those the negative thoughts can kind of intrude. So sometimes when an athlete has a bad performance, I'll just say, "Hey, look, you used your frontal lobe too much. It got in the way of your performance." So really, I think for many athletes, particularly like the 100-meter dash. When you're very well trained, let your training do the walk talking and let your training walk you through there. Trust your training and let that guide to that because research even shows that when you're using your cerebellum, you're actually consuming less energy and you're being more efficient than you are when you're using your more cognitive frontal lobes. So hopefully that's a good answer for the clarification between the frontal lobes and the cerebellum with regards to sports activities.
Oh yeah, that's great. And doesn't the cerebellum have something to do with the zone, or otherwise known as a state of flow?
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned flow. That was from Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, a researcher who looked at the idea of flow, which is that sweet spot you want to be when we're completely immersed in an activity we love we're doing. Not necessarily sports, but it could be art, it could be painting, it could be literature, it could be even teaching, where we just lose track of our conscious self, and we just lose track of time. Sometimes in the flow that people say that things slow down and our thought processes shift away from those cognitive frontal lobes and more to your unconscious, and I suppose your cerebellum would be more active in those things. So absolutely the cerebellum would be more active in your flow state because sometimes you might not even realize how long you've been doing a task or how long you've been doing a performance because you're relying more on your automatic unconscious processes that's associated with your cerebellum.
Got it. So you know all these functions and these parts of the brain and what they do. So do you think memorizing these functions and what the cerebellum does, for example, is important for athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. I would, say to them in big contests, trust your training. It almost sounds cliche, but let the cerebellum, which is responsible for skill memory, do its thing. You've been trained to do this, let the cerebellum do its thing, and don't let that frontal lobe that is doubting sometimes and trying to come up with logical reasons for failure to get in the way. So absolutely. Then there are certain times when you want to use your frontal lobes in your sports, and we'll talk talk about those things as well. But for a lot of times you can overthink things, and that's why the I think it's helpful to say, let your cerebellum do its thing, and don't let your frontal lobes get in the way.
How does an athlete actually tell its brain to like let the cerebellum do its thing? Like it's not just a switch.
Again, if you can just tell that athlete, again, my cliche, trust your training. I mean, you've done this before, and I'll hopefully some of these other questions you'll talk about, some of these visualization strategies may help it, elicit that. Um, but I would just, tell an athlete, hey, look, you've done this before, you've trained this, you've practiced this, and just let your body do its thing, let its cerebellum do its thing.
I see. And yeah, we'll talk about visualization right now. So you sent me that
Mhm.
information on how the Navy SEALs use brain brace strategies to help with training. Can you talk about that and what they do?
Okay. Let me talk about, how about if I talk about visual? You want me to talk about the SEALs first, or should I just go over visualization in general? Do you have a preference? Do I start with the SEALs first, or you want me to go with sports?
You could do visualization first and then Navy SEALs second.
Okay, we'll do that then. Cool. Um, I would say, there are, visualizations. I remember like, sometimes coaches say, imagine yourself, you know, I've done some sports in high school. I did wrestling, I did baseball, a little bit of running. Um, but the coach saying, imagine yourself in this position where you're, taking them down in a two-legged takedown, and imagine yourself going in there and taking that shot. And I thought it was kind of corny. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, imagine myself. How about I just do it? But no, I mean, there's a lot of research that shows that the value of visualization, which will be like one of the things that the Navy SEALs can do. Um, and the research, this actually goes back to the 1970s. I think the Soviets were amongst the first to really use visualization strategies for their athletes. And it's got a whole bunch of different advocates since then. Um, Tiger Woods has been using visualization strategies ever since his preteen years. Um, World champion golfer Jack Nicklaus has once said, quote, I never hit a shot, not even my practice, without having a very sharp and focused picture in my head, end quote. Even heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali, the late great, even used visualizations when he was thinking about in the ring. Um, it's really, 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 really helpful to do this because it kind of activates the same areas in the brain when you're actually involved with the task. So if you think about running, it activates your motor cortex, which you use to move your legs. So then when you're actually in that situation, your brain has a sense of familiarity. Our cross country coach, Tim Hetrick, uh, the day before, the night before, we were ready to run our first cross country championship with our girls from Wyomissing. This was back in 1999 at Hershey Stadium. And yeah, home of Hershey chocolate. That's what the cross country championships were. We were right on top of the hill, overlooking the entire cross country course. And he brought our girls team up there and said, now imagine there you are going through the first mile, going through the mile and a half, going through this 2 mile. There you are going up the hill, and you guys are going for that state championship. And it was awesome. And we had background music playing Eye of the Tiger, kind of jazz us up. And the girls just imagined themselves going through that. And they crushed it. They crushed one of the first of our four state medalists that year. And they said that they had much less jitters going through that race because they kind of raced it through in their head, and it made some of the apprehension and go away. So visualization can have a really powerful effect. um, One last piece of research I found to show the value of visualization. This sounds a little bit crazy. In some cases, the research have found that like mental practice is almost not quite as effective as true physical practice. For example, there was this study on everyday people. An exercise physiologist it was from the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, Ohio, compared results of those who did physical exercises as opposed to those who did virtual workouts in their heads. They were doing like finger strength exercises, and those who actually did the finger stretch exercises increased their strength by about 53%. Okay. However, the group that just did mental, they picture themselves doing these finger exercises, had an increase of 35%. So that's pretty good. I mean, 53 to 35%. Um, so there was a significant gains of this finger stretch. Just visualize yourself doing that. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. With regards to your with your Navy SEALs there, um, the Navy SEALs have used training because they realize that obviously there's a lot of cognitive forces at work with fear. They wanted to get their recruits to pass the pool comp, which is one of the more difficult parts of the whole Navy SEALs program. All of it looks really difficult. Um, so the four aspects what the Navy SEALs try to teach their recruits to better pass the fear of this pool test is fourfold. One is goal setting, where you set your goals and you break down your goals into little parts. Like, for example, you would say, okay, you have a 10-mile run today. It sucks, but break it down. Okay, look, I'm going to get through the first mile. All right. When I'm getting through the first mile, I'm going to realize, hey, I'm into this. And now I'm going to look forward to my second mile. So breaking down a large goal in small parts is pretty helpful. Positive self-talk. Oftentimes we get negative in self, and just teach yourself to, as we say to our athletes, have that positive conversation with yourself. So when you're going through that 1 mile mark, you feel, okay, I got this. I got this. I'm where I want to be. You know, my pace is good. I'm not out too fast. I like where I'm at. This is good. The third thing was visualization, which I spoke of, where visualize yourself going through the task. Because I said before, it activates the same areas of the brain when you actually do the task. And finally, arousal control. I mentioned arousal control is simply controlling how your body's heart rate is and minimizing that. Sometimes just breathing techniques can help minimize that, because we become agitated as our heart races and fear ensues. So controlling the physiological, predictors of those things, such as your heart rate and breathing, can also help. So that is the Navy SEALs and what their take is on brain and passing the pool comp.
That's great. Thank you for all that information, and I'll link that video below because I think it's super helpful as well. And what do you think is one common myth about our brains in relation to sports?
Huh, that's a good question there. Well, there's a lot of them out there. Obviously, we're getting a lot better with like concussions. When I was in high school, you got your head hit. Oh, you just got a little ringer. Get back in there. Obviously, there's a lot more research and there's a lot more awareness of the damage of concussion. So I think, those things are being, set aside. So I think that a lot of those myths related to concussions have been set aside. Trying to think of what would be another great brain myth for sports. I'm not really coming up with off the top of my mind. I'll talk about some current trends though, which I think I'll save for at the end.
Great.
You said like brain myths. I have a lot of brain myths, but not necessarily are sports related.
Oh, why don't you just talk about those brain myths then?
Okay. Oh well, some of them are like the most famous one, obviously, we only use 10% of our brain. Okay, that is the one that is probably the most quoted. I cringe because sometimes I still see this like on TV shows or that things that tend to be like very pseudo scientific. I cringe. We only use 10% of our brain. Just think how smart Einstein could be. Well, I'll tell you what. Okay, grab a baseball or any kind of ball and throw it. Okay, believe it or not, you are utilizing about 3/4 of your brain that very task. Okay, so the idea that we only use 10% of our brain is a myth, and it originates back to like the turn of the century when they would use primitive ways to study the brain, which were electrical stimulation, and probably only about 10% of the time you would see an obvious, reaction, a motor function or a sensory function, and oftentimes you stimulate large parts of the brain, nothing obvious happens. But a lot of researchers erroneously concluded then, well, if we're not seeing anything happen, I guess we don't use that part of our brain. So I guess that would be probably the greatest brain myth. And if you put someone in a fMRI, functioning MRI, which looks at how much blood and oxygen are consumed when we do a task. Usually, about 3/4 of your brain is involved with that because you have to first use your occipital lobe to visualize what you're looking at. You have to use your temporal lobe and your Wernicke's area to understand the instructions of throw me the ball. You'll have to use your motor cortex to move your arm. You have to use your cerebellum to help guide that process and maintain your balance. Your parietal lobe judges, distance and revolving spatial relationships. Your medulla is keeping your heart breathing. So there's a lot going on there with just a simple task. So that 10% myth is hopefully, it's hard for that to die, but it's still around, unfortunately.
So how much percent do you think we do on everyday tasks?
We're using our brain almost all the time. I would probably say we're using it almost all of it all the time. I would say probably, 50 to 90% all the time.
Got it. Yeah, that was super interesting. Do you have any other general brain myths?
Okay. The idea that you are, left-brained or right-brained, we use both our hemispheres. Okay, we use both the hemispheres. We have one brain but in two hemispheres, and someone might say, "Well, I'm such a left-brain logical person." Okay, now I mean, no, you just use your left hemisphere, but you need that right hemisphere to convey faces, to look at faces and recognize faces. You need that right hemisphere to maybe bring a little bit of holistic to it, the bigger picture of what you're looking at. So even an artist that says, "Well, I'm such a right hemisphere person," well, you need your left hemisphere to speak, to talk, to communicate. So we're not just like one hemisphere. I think that's also a myth.
That's great. Thank you for that. And what are some brain training techniques that help people in sports?
Okay, good question there. Well, one simple way, and this is from Tom Brady, okay? One of the simplest way Brady says is just getting regular routines and sleep. Sleep is one of the safest, cheapest ways to help maintain your athlete's edge. Brady reports going to bed at 9 p.m. and waking up at 6 a.m. And he says getting 9 uninterrupted hours of sleep is cheap therapy and good regeneration for his body and his brain. So right there is one really good one. Um, and Tom Brady is also a little bit of a mental athlete as well. Um, he says that he also uses neuroscience to train his body into forming new habits, and he calls this neural priming. Okay, I, the fancy way of this is just saying, look, you want to get stronger, faster connections in your brain, and you need to practice the habit or skill again and again and again and again. So there's a reason why that your coach makes you shoot all those free throws. There's a reason why that if you're a quarterback, you're making all those throws through those holes, through those targets. Okay, the more you practice that habit or skill behavior, the way you automatically your brains will recognize it, and that helps create that move to the cerebellum, okay, where it becomes more automatic. So the old cliche is practice makes perfect. I guess you can expand that for neurosciences. Practice makes the memory go from your frontal lobes to your cerebellum. So I guess those two things, I mean, sleep and just practice. I mean, there's nothing new with those things, but sometimes we neglect those things, especially the sleep. Here is, Tom Brady was arguably the greatest quarterback ever, the football generation, getting like 9 hours sleep. It's like, come on, you sissy. But he recognizes the value of sleep, and why it's good for his body as well as his brain.
I see. And that just reminded me, is there any relation between like muscle memory and our real brain?
I would say a lot of people like to use muscle memory and will say that it's in your muscles. It's really not. It's really not. It's more like cerebellum memory, but oftentimes we use that, muscle memory, but it's really, really, really cerebellum memory, because the muscles don't recall how to do a task. It's the cerebellum that does that. So it's sort of the same thing, but it's more like cerebellum memory than muscle memory.
I see. And I know in psychology you touch on like neuroplasticity. Is there any
Mhm.
connection with that and sports?
Absolutely, because every time that you are creating new connections or new pathways, theoretically, that is plasticity. So when you learn new tasks, when you learn new skills, that is plasticity in a way. So maybe if you, I don't know, you were a baseball hitter and now you're going to take more practice switching to your left side as opposed to your right side. You're forming new connections in there, okay? That's plasticity. The task of learning to become a switch hitter, it takes a great deal of plasticity to be able to hit from both sides of the plate. So absolutely, that's a nice connection, Brandon. You must have been a good psychology student or something to make that connection between the two.
Got it. And do you have any general tips or a couple tips for our younger student athletes from a neurological perspective?
Okay. Um, I would say what Tom Brady says is so important, sleep, and it's double important for adolescents who need, 9 hours of sleep at least. We tend to neglect these things, especially in COVID when we don't have the opportunities we have all to get out and do things, and we have all these commitments, on the computer, sometimes late at night. We kind of neglect our sleep and another sleeping pattern, regular sleeping patterns. That's something else that Tom Brady said. Just get into a regular sleeping pattern. Avoid the Sunday night insomnias. Um, Practice, practice, practice. As I said, like I said, sounds a cliche, but that is what neural priming with Tom Brady calls. So eat healthy as well, because the brain it responds better to things with like omega-3 fatty acids, good fatty oils, so that actually there is nutrition involved as well. So I guess nutrition, sleep and practice, practice, practice. Those are the things I would recommend to student athletes.
Yeah, that's great. And I think a misconception that a lot of younger people get is like you could sleep less during the school days and just catch up on the weekends. Can you talk about why that's
Yeah.
bad?
Yeah, it's your sleep debt. It's not good because what it does is it really whacks out your circadian rhythms. We really operate best when we go to bed at the right time, because our brain is a finely tuned machine which has these circadian rhythms, which is our 24-hour body clock. That's at 3 a.m., the hypothalamus says time to order the endocrine system and a pituitary gland to release, growth hormones. So, but if you're going to bed one night at 11 p.m. and next night at 2 I'm sorry, at 11 p.m. one night and going to bed again, I don't know, at 2 a.m., you're going to throw the whole cycle out of whack. And you're awake when your hypothalamus wants to tell your body to release hormones, and it throws everything out of whack. So that's one of the problems with the idea of, staying up and then catching up on the sleep. I mean, I think it can, you can sleep in a couple hours on the weekend, that would help. But just to say, hey man, I'm really going to sleep for 12 hours on the weekend and catch up on all that sleep that I missed, you're not really going to be super efficient by doing that.
Got it. And are there any new developments in neuroscience or psychology that connect with sports?
Yeah, obviously a lot more emphasis on the brain, how it relates to sports, and you ever hear the Wonderlic test from football?
No, can you talk about that?
Oh, okay. This has been go Google this thing, and I'll bring this up because I always think this is fascinating. I would say about 50 years, there was a psychological assessment that was created for intelligence. It is a 50 multiple choice test, and it looks at processing speed, judgment, things like that. And really, I think it was actually made in the 1930s, the Wonderlic test. And I would probably say for about 50 years or so, the NFL has been using this test, and NFL like recruiters want their prospects to take this test to see the intangibles of how bright they are, what kind of judgments they make, what kind of skills they make. And over the years, it's had some at some point, and obviously quarterbacks are the ones that most frequently take this test. And some people like to point because quarterbacks need to be bright, they need to be the field generals, they need these kind of skills. It was actually used for now I remember the Wonderlic test was actually used to test fighter pilots who needed to be able to do split decisions, quick thinking in time constraints, much like a football player or a quarterback would. So I could see the parallels. So over the years, some people have really touted this Wonderlic test as being, a super effective. Others have said, no way, this has not been super effective. Like Dan Marino, arguably one of the greatest quarterbacks of his generation, scored a 15 out of 50, which is not very, very good. Um, the guy from Miami, Tua, I think he scored like a 19 out of 50. Also not very good. But he's a rookie, so it remains to be seen how good he is. But he was pretty good for Alabama. Um, Fitzpatrick, the guy, he's been all around the NFL. I think he's currently with Miami right now. I think he scored a 48 out of 50. Well, he's a graduate of Harvard, so no wonder, I guess. Um, so a lot of people would argue that maybe it has not been a very good predictor, and in the NFL, it certainly hasn't predicted draft order in the NFL. However, I just read something in the Business Insider over the last like decade. They revisited this Wonderlic test and see it was an accurate portrayal of future NFL success. What they found out that it really didn't have much correlation with like your draft order, like your draft pick, so to speak. But it did find out a fairly moderate correlation that the Wonderlic test did a decent job predicting like long-term success. So NFL players that would have like a higher one on those may be more likely to have more long-term success, 5, 6, 7 years in the league, so to speak. Interesting enough, the New England Patriots, who've had their own dynasty, obviously, they like when their future players take this test, and not just quarterbacks, but other skill positions. So the Patriots kind of invested kind of heavily in this Wonderlic test as a measure of cognitive kind of skills. So I would say I think that's a kind of interesting. I hear the Wonderlic. So once upon a time, yeah, this is going to be the way to pick your quarterbacks. It fallen out of favor for a while, and now it seems to be kind of uh, in the middle ground. Maybe it doesn't do a great job predicting your draft picks now, but it has a you know, moderately good predictor, I would say, of long-term success. I think I heard some kind of scout saying, look, it's not a make or break test, but if you got two athletes who are has similar physical qualities and they're relatively the same, but one scores better on the Wonderlic test, let the Wonderlic test be like the tiebreaker if you're going to choose to draft this person or this person. So I read about that Wonderlic testing thing, and I thought that might be a cool thing to present to this podcast.
Great. And do you have any other last remarks or comments that you want to share?
I just think this is great that you got a podcast for this. I never did a podcast before. I was kind of excited to do this, and I'm just real excited to bring the knowledge of psychology to all audiences, especially young audiences. And I think there's a lot of applications for psychology. So if you're not just simply interested in psychology because you want to be a therapist or you don't want to help out someone with schizophrenia, but you can see there's a quite the obvious application here in sports, and it's kind of cool, Brandon, that you're making the connection between the two here. So thank you for inviting me for this to talk about some of my favorite subjects, sports and psychology.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for being here. It was great speaking to you, and I appreciate your super knowledgeable outlook on neuroscience, our brain, and sports psych. I guess that's it, right?
Yep, that sounds good.
Thank you for being here, everybody, and goodbye.